We just finished talking about how researchers were trying to use cannabis to control the side effects of cancer therapy, but that the cannabis itself had bad side effects. More on drugs. A multi-million-dollar study has just started at the University of North Carolina to try and uncover the neurological and psychological factors that lead to some adolescents with anxiety symptoms to use psychoactive substances, including alcohol. The researchers will follow children between 12 and 14 who report symptoms of anxiety. They will then be followed for 5 years, and information on things like their home life and their response to stress will be assessed. The main goal is to find out why some teenagers with anxiety end up using harmful substances. We also want to understand how our brain is involved in this connection. By figuring this out, we can better create personalized ways to help stop teenagers from going down the wrong path with substance use. Moving to Johannesburg now. Researchers have found a way to capture visible light for use in solar panels. Now, this is hot off the press. Current solar panels use the ultraviolet or UV wavelengths of light. UV light has shorter wavelengths than visible light. Now, the team from the University of Johannesburg has found a way to make chemicals react to light, that is, a photocatalyst, that reacts with the wavelengths of light in the visible spectrum. This means that we could use more efficiently the light that comes from the sun, because we can use a greater range of wavelengths of light. This is a pretty big deal. So the UV spectrum is quite small, right? It's a very small range of wavelengths. Now, if we can include the visible spectrum as well, we're looking at a substantial increase in solar panel effectiveness. I'm very excited about this. I think you should be too. This is the future. And as an added bonus, the material the team have made will use very few metals. Metals in current solar panels like platinum, palladium, or gold are expensive and not fantastic from an environmental point of view. So we may soon have more efficient, even cheaper, and even more environmentally friendly solar panels. I'll keep you up to date with any more breakthroughs. A paper released this week recounts the story of a treasure trove found in New Zealand. In 2020, during Auckland's water care excavation of 2 large vertical shafts for a significant upgrade to the primary pipeline responsible for transporting sewage from the central city for treatment, workers unexpectedly came across an ancient shell bed. Auckland-based paleontologist Bruce Hayward drew a parallel, likening the discovery to uncovering valuable treasure right at one's doorstep. Upon realizing the importance of the fossil deposit, both Watercare and their contractors eagerly collaborated to assist researchers. A substantial quantity of sandy material containing shells was deposited in a nearby field, facilitating the work of paleontologists over the course of several months. In addition, Watercare provided funding for 2 graduate students specializing in paleontology. Under the guidance of Auckland Museum curator, Dr. Wilma Blom, these students meticulously combed through the deposited material for several weeks. The diligent effort led to the examination of an estimated 300,000 fossils, resulting in the retrieval of thousands of species that are now showcased at the museum nearby as a testament to this extraordinarily rare discovery. Imagine for a moment, let's go back to the political, back to uni politics. Imagine for a moment if your parents can't read, or maybe they don't work. What are your chances of getting into university? Well, they've improved. A few weeks ago, the Albanese government made it easier for Australians from disadvantaged backgrounds to access university by getting rid of the need to get over 50% to pass the subject. This has been tried in France, and it just produces students that are not able to meet the standard that was previously required. The real solution, in my opinion, is to improve primary and secondary education so that people from disadvantaged backgrounds can get the support that they need throughout their childhood, not leaving it until early adulthood and trying to fix everything at university. Funnily enough, research released this week has found that UK's grammar schools are not producing higher GCSE scores than non-selective comprehensive schools. The GCSE is the test kids take in Year 10 when they're 15 or 16 in our king's country. The findings from the paper by lead author Dr. Binwei Liu found that children with the highest marks in grade 11 were less likely to achieve top GCSE marks if they attended a grammar school than if they attended a non-selective school, once other background factors were taken into account. The paper concludes that expanding England's 163 grammar schools would be expensive, and there's no evidence that it would raise standards. Basically, the paper found out that, contrary to popular belief, educational selection was detrimental to high performers. Possible reasons for this are that pupils in selective schools are comparing themselves to very high performers, so they might see themselves as less able, which might be demotivating. Secondly, the stress of a competitive system might have negative performance effects. And lastly, London doesn't have that many selective grammar schools, but students there do have high grades. So London students might pull up the non-selective average. I don't know why the authors didn't look at the data in London and separate that from the data outside of London to control for this. Nevertheless, that's how it is. I couldn't find a paper that included anywhere near the 500,000 students like the UK study from Australia. But I did turn up a paper from 2018 from the University of Melbourne that said there was a small advantage conferred to students that went to selective schools, which could be explained by the higher motivation showed by students that applied to selective schools. Basically, if you're motivated enough to apply for a selective school, you're just more motivated to get good marks. Being in zero gravity reduces your immune system's effectiveness. What? Yeah, going to space makes your immune cells worse at fighting infection. That could make travel sickness even worse for anyone who's holidaying on Mars. But why does this phenomenon occur? A team from Karolinska Institutet in Sweden sought to find out. The team simulates zero gravity by putting people on a custom waterbed. This is called dry immersion. Dry immersion is a lot cheaper than shooting someone off into space and stimulates the redistribution of liquids in the body and the lack of one's weight being supported by their legs. One of the types of white blood cells that learn from previous infection, known as T cells, adapted to the lack of gravity by acting more naive. Throughout one's lifetime, T cells go from naive to affected T cells, which adapt differently to infections throughout your life, through turning off and on certain genes in your DNA sequence. During this study, the T cells acted more naive during day 7 and 14 of dry immersion, and 7 days after dry immersion finished. So the paper suggests ways to counteract this change in expressed genes. Hello, welcome back to Peer Review, your guide to the week on science. The Milky Way was initially believed to be a flat disk. This is the path of least resistance for objects to rotate around the center of our galaxy. However, measurements taken in the mid-20th century revealed that it's actually bent at the edges, which doesn't make any sense. It's inexplicable. The orbit actually looks like a slightly crushed sombrero. Recent simulations have revealed that an invisible halo of misaligned dark matter could be to blame. Researchers simulated a young Milky Way with a dark matter halo tilt, and then they let it run for 5 billion simulated years. The results are a galaxy with a very similar bend in it than the one that we can observe, suggesting that dark matter could be the cause. The dark matter around our Milky Way may have fallen out of kilter because of a collision with another galaxy a long time ago. An episode of Peer Review wouldn't be complete without some health chat, so we're not just talking about aliens today. The body is made up of many different types of cells, from tiny cells that initiate blood clots called platelets to much bigger muscle cells. If we blew up platelets to the size of a pygmy possum, which can fit on your finger, muscle cells would be the size of a blue whale. There's a mathematical inverse relationship between the size and number of cells. So there are more little cells than big ones. What's more, cells of different size classes all have a similar total mass, which means small, numerous cells, such as red blood cells, contribute the same amount to the body's total mass as the larger cells. Researchers reported 2 days ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which you may know by its acronym PNAS. Finding this pattern took a tremendous amount of data. Over 1,500 cadavers were analysed to find the average male-female and child cell sizes. In case you're wondering, an adult male has 36 trillion cells, and a female has around 28 trillion. For comparison, there are only 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe. This research could help us understand abnormalities such as cancer. Scientists are re-examining the DNA of Otzi. I am not sure if that's how you pronounce it. It's got the umlauts. Otzi, the Iceman, a 5,300-year-old mummy found in the Alps. Previous analysis suggested his ancestors were from the Caspian steppe, northeast of the Black Sea. But it doesn't align with his age. Other people with steppe ancestry didn't appear in the genetic record of Central Europe until about 400 years after Otzi's death. The new study found that this steppe ancestry wasn't accurate due to the Iceman's DNA being contaminated with modern DNA. Instead, about 90% of Otzi's genetic heritage came from Neolithic farmers, a high proportion for the Copper Age. The new genome also revealed he had male pattern baldness and darker skin than depicted in previous artists' depictions, with light genes becoming prevalent much later in human history than previously thought. Genes conferring light skin tones didn't become prevalent until 4,000 to 3,000 years ago, according to Johannes Krauss of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. And that happened because as people moved north and they started to eat a plant-based diet, they didn't get as much vitamin D from animal sources, so their skin went lighter. And in animal news, a lethal fungus is killing our frogs. Australia has 247 species of frogs, according to our last count. But research from the University of Western Australia has found that there might soon be only 246. The cause is an invasive species of fungus. Not naming any names, it's probably from Korea. Anyway, it's not their fault. From the archives, Papa Pinto micro pigs and Yorkshire pigs played a joystick-operated video game. They used their snouts to steer a cursor on the screen. It's pretty impressive given that pigs are long-sighted. They continue to play even when not giving food as a reward, probably for social interaction. So, we're all just some pigs, you know? If you're out there playing new Space Skyrim, that's you. And that was published in Frontiers in Psychology from Purdue University in Indiana in 2021. Hello. I just want to say that I'm going to be mentioning rape in this episode, so if you don't want to hear about that, tune out for the next 10 minutes. This is Peer Review, your guide to the week in science. I'm James, recording on Ngunnawal in Ngambri land. Scene 1. Imagine a sleek bathtub nestled beneath a glass roof. Soft, ambient lighting casts a warm shadow over the entire scene. The hum of the city fades in the distance. She held up a bath bomb and dropped it. She watched the colours blend and swirl together. Stepped into the tub. Now, if I'm not too bad of a storyteller, I've set the mood and you should be expecting something to come up. Perhaps you've already started picturing what happens next. Whether it's the bubbling waters, she experienced the depths of passion, or does she experience new human rights? We'll find out, and we'll get back to that as well. When you're setting a scene and adding characters and getting ready for the action to happen, this could be defined as a fantasy. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, a fantasy is a pleasant situation one enjoys thinking about but is unlikely to happen, or the activity of imagining things. It's different, but a bit similar to a dream. One study claims that erotic novels have increased the popularity of the topic of sexual fantasies and the normalization of previously deviant fantasies. But where do fantasies come from? Well, the word fantasy comes from the French. Freud coined the term fantasy. I might just go over some concepts quickly of Freud's. You have the id, which is the unconscious need to fulfill a desire. If its needs aren't met, you have a tension within you. This is satisfied through the idea that there's something unknown about us that comes up through fantasies. So the fantasies are an unknown part of yourself. Then you have the ego, which is trying to find an equilibrium between the id and the superego. The ego is in perpetual conflict. Then you have the superego, which controls id and impulses about morals, norms, rules, what can be said and done. Production of one's imagination suggested by the unconscious with imaginary scenes in which one transposes their desires, traumatic experience, anxieties, etc. But these don't come out of nowhere, these imaginings of ours. There's an idea that what's buried deep in our unconscious mind can surprise oneself sometimes. There's a notion that there may be an unknown other within us, like a part of us that we ignore. A great proportion of child sexual abuse survivors experience sexual fantasies relating to the abuse endured, for example. Fantasies about not being able to give consent. Deviant sexual behavior is defined by two papers as sexual behavior that is against the law or against social norms. But I don't like this definition because what is socially acceptable changes. Another study found that most convicted sex offenders had violent or deviant sexual fantasies. It's important to recognize not everyone who has deviant sexual fantasies will act on them. It's important to note that it's difficult to get the truth in studies on sexual behavior because it's so hard to get into someone's head and for them to talk openly about their fantasies, because there can be shame and stuff like that attached to them. And also, a study shouldn't focus only on child sexual abuse survivors or prisoners. Studies should focus on general populations. In a study of 566 adults, published in the Archives of Sexual Behavior, found that most fantasies previously labeled as deviant are actually common. There are 4 common themes. Romance, around 9 out of 10 people had fantasies which involve romance. Pain-related and power dynamics, these are often interrelated and can be, sometimes are mentioned together, which are experienced by around 19 out of 20 people. And the last theme, sexual violence, aka rape fantasies, are found in 7 out of 10 women and 9 out of 10 men, with more than half of the two genders studied predominantly identifying as the victim, not the perpetrator, in these sexual violence fantasies. But what about the science? What about the hormones? It's not just what's happened to us in our experience. It can also be the chemicals inside of us. Let's think about Big Mouth on Netflix. We have these raging hormones that rise during our adolescence. There's several perspectives in research like this, which identify raging hormones as why people go through adolescence earlier. So if you have more hormones earlier, you're going to become sexually matured faster. So basically there's this idea that in adolescence, our hormones mediate our sexual arousal. However, the link between hormonal and neural organic basis for the emergence of sexual cognitions is unclear. So, for example, total testosterone barely correlates, it does, but barely correlates to sexual fantasies in pubertal boys. So R equals 0.28 in this study, which is a weak correlation. The National Center on the Sexual Behavior of Youth and Adolescents says that adolescence is the time for increased sexual thoughts and feelings and the onset of sexual fantasies. So it does seem that there is, like I say, there is a link between higher levels of sex hormones, increasing your degree of sexual attraction, arousal, and fantasy. Adolescents and those going through puberty have their brain developing at the same time, and this is accompanied by major transformations, physical, emotional, and hormonal. Production of androgen and estrogen are significant contributors to sexual maturation as well. Dr. Bronsley has stated that sexual fantasies is a regular evolution in the sexual maturation of teens and a significant part of the development stage of adolescence. Sexual fantasies arrive when we are going through physiological changes, and many people report their first feelings of sexual arousal at around 12 years old. One of the guys interviewed in one of the studies that I looked at said he was really into legs. He reckons it's because he saw a burlesque show in a movie when he was 12, and that had a strong emotional effect on him. A person's first sexual experience plays a critical role in the development of sexual fantasies. Two other things that might have an effect on fantasies are emotional attachment and sexual compulsion. So some people are more compulsive based on a questionnaire which has questions like, my desires to have sex have disrupted my daily life, which to me begs the question, where does this compulsion come from and what's at the bottom? It seems that in this study, they're saying that some people just have higher sexual compulsion just because, I guess it'd be genetics. It's important to remember sexual fantasies are just one specific type of fantasy. Overall, it's about our ability to imagine sexual situations and pretend they're real. It's about recreating the world as we perceive it, while adding maybe other parts that haven't really happened into our imagined reality. Which brings us to creating new human rights. Human rights acknowledge that all people have inherent value, regardless of their background or anything. They articulated several key principles, which are dignity, equality, and mutual respect. They are articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the UN, which came about in 1948. We can fantasize about a new human right, the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environments. Actually, this isn't a human right that doesn't exist yet. This resolution was adopted by the UN last year because of an acknowledgement of environmental degradation and climate change as interconnected with human rights crises. For example, access to water doesn't exist in international law or explicitly as a human right, but it is derived from other rights. And there are political and social and economic implications. In the same way, you could think that the right to a healthy, clean environment is derived, but why not just call it out? I want to live somewhere clean, right? I want the right to a healthy environment that's thriving and sustainable. It's going to be there forever. It's not going to just become a desert or, dry out. Something like that. Hannah Arendt has another idea about rights. Should I just say right? She believes there's only one right, dignity. According to this theory, all other rights derive from this one. If we stick to this perspective, do we need to enshrine more rights to ensure that all human beings have dignity? Or is creating more rights irrelevant since we failed to ensure human dignity? Basically, a lot of people in the world don't have access to a clean environment. There's a lot of pollution in the oceans. There's a lot of air that's hard to breathe. And by making a human right, we might be able to force stakeholders to take economic, social, and environmental actions that protect humans and nature. Although we could debate about the efficiency of creating a human right to make these changes. There's this idea also of re-enchanting the world. Creating new rights is one way to reflect society's evolution. We've got new challenges, different perspectives. There was a point not too long ago where we didn't have women's rights. So we could see that the aspirations of the past have brought us to where we are at the moment. This brings us back to the notion of the ideal and a potential alternative reality. Before we get to re-enchantment, there's the notion of disenchantment. Max Weber described this in the early 20th century. This desacralization of society, as in no one believes in anything anymore. This idea has caused societies to become more secular and also at the same time to lose meaning. There's a trend that when there's a crisis, no matter what kind, there can be a re-enchanting process. So that gives things meaning again, in a secular way. Re-enchantment is a new ethics, a way to find meaning again. It's about how the world should be run, fighting forces that destroy resources, societies, and cultures so that we can fix crises. Re-enchantment is making the world more like the utopia you imagine.
If we think about the ecological crisis as how it will affect our feelings and emotions, we can reconnect with our emotions and by the power of imagination, think about what the world could be like, which leads us to the process of actually improving things. For example, re-enchant suburban blocks that are all grey with high crime. There's a group of people called urbanists that thought that we need trees and we need to bring joy to people, improve their emotions. Urban planning is a huge area of research, from walkability to improved infrastructure. I wish someone would plan Canberra better. It might be the most planned city in Australia, but in my opinion, the planning was bad. There's a lack of social space, vast swathes of suburban houses without adequate infrastructure, and not enough region to choose a mode of transport that's not a car. By being creative and getting closer to your fellow humans, we could take actions that bring about an imagined ideal future, giving life meaning. Can creativity be used as a political tool? Well, I think, yeah. You can realize your fantasies through politics. All right, so we just finished talking about how moonshot fantasies about a different society could lead to creating new rights to an environmentally friendly, sustainable life. Speaking of the moon, why does it look so damn big when it's on the horizon? When it's peeking through a thicket of trees, it looks absolutely huge compared to when it's hanging up from the heavens. The moon's circumference is about 11,000 kilometers, a bit less than the average Aussie drives every year. And it orbits the Earth at a distance of about 380,000 kilometers, which is the number of clicks on my uncle's 96 model Holden. The moon is the same size as it moves across the sky. So, the fact that it looks bigger on the horizon is an optical illusion. If you outstretch your finger next to the huge moon on the horizon, you see it's about the same size as your fingertip. Now, when you do the same when it's overhead, you'll see that the moon is the exact same size. Also, if you take a photo of the moon in two places with the same settings, you'll see that they're the same size in both photos. So why does it look so big? Well, there's no satisfying scientific answer. When the moon is close to the horizon, it looks a little bit squashed because of the atmosphere acting like a weak lens. But that doesn't make it look bigger. There is a proposed explanation that our brains expect an object to be a certain size when it's on the horizon. It seems our brains don't realize the distance between us and the moon. Our brain sort of changes the distance that we expect the moon to be away from us, depending on where it is in the sky, even though it doesn't move further away from us on any given night by too much. Kind of like the Ponzo illusion. If you get lines that converge like a wall and train tracks, and when you move a figure along those lines, the figure looks bigger or smaller. So basically, when the moon is behind some trees on the horizon, we think that it's a certain size because of the foreground that we can compare it to. And we don't have that same reference when it's up in the sky. But weirdly, NASA astronauts also see the moon illusion from space. So it can't just be that. And that's one of the unanswered interesting questions in science. Something that is being answered is malaria. This is something I'm following very closely, and it's right down to earth. Malaria vaccines. Malaria kills 12,000 people a week, usually pregnant women and children in places like Papua New Guinea and Africa. Climate change is increasing the area of the world that's hospitable for mosquitoes that host the infection. Just today, the second ever malaria vaccine was given a recommendation by the WHO, and it's now set to have its production increased by a huge amount and to roll out all around the tropics. The Matrix M vaccine, first produced by the University of Oxford, is now going to be produced in India. The University of Oxford tested the vaccine on hundreds of children aged 5 to 17 months in Burkina Faso and found it to have somewhere between 70 and 80% effectiveness in preventing malaria, depending on the dose. The researchers injected infants with either a low dose of the new vaccine, a high dose of the new vaccine, or a rabies vaccine, which serves as the control and something to compare to. Those that received the rabies vaccine had the highest incidence of malaria. Today we're going to talk about alcohol because I got really drunk last night and I want to talk about what I put my body through. There's this old wives' tale that sugary alcoholic drinks give you a worse hangover.
It's also thrown around that eating while you drink reduces your hangover. To my eye, these two things seem to contradict. Sugar, or more specifically sucrose in white sugar or fructose in fruits, are a carbohydrate, and it's a useful form of energy. And while it's not the same as a meal, which includes fats and protein, it does give you one of those three macromolecules, being carbohydrates, fats, and protein. So it seems to me like sugar would help to a degree when drinking alcohol. But let's see what the literature says. First off, alcohols are any molecule that has an oxygen and a hydrogen group stuck somewhere in it, like methanol, ethanol, propanol, and butanol. These alcohols have 1, 2, 3, and 4 carbons in them respectively. But the one that I'm going to talk about today, the one that's in your beer and wine and vodka, the one that makes your cheeks red and your mood lift, at least in the short term, is ethanol. It's the exact same molecule in Goon that's in Hennessy that drinkers are looking for to get a buzz. Ethanol in small quantities damages cells, increases your risk of cancers, including breast cancer, and in large enough quantities can kill you. So because of that, it's defined as a poison. It is processed by an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase to form acetaldehyde, which is toxic. This is further broken down by aldehyde dehydrogenase, which is another enzyme. When it's got dehydrogenase, it takes off the bloody hydroxyl, which is the oxygen-hydrogen group. It speeds up that reaction. Speeding up a reaction, that's what enzymes do. So it's further broken down by aldehyde dehydrogenase to form acetate. Acetate is further broken down to carbon dioxide and water to be peed out and breathed out. So some people have a gene which is particularly common in Asians, which means they have low levels of aldehyde dehydrogenase, which means that the toxic acetaldehyde builds up. As it's not being processed, that causes the drinker's face to go red and other parts of their body to flush. That's the Asian flush. You might have heard of it. Now that we know how alcohol is broken down, we can tell how it will give us a hangover, or like I had this morning, hangxiety. The anxiety you get when you drank a lot the night before. Ethanol causes dopamine levels to rise initially, which through a cascade of events makes you feel good. But after a while, your dopamine levels drop below their starting point, at which point you might opt for another drink, but you won't get the same peak that you experienced with the first drink, and the slump in dopamine will be worse. The slump in dopamine hangs around after you've stopped drinking. Add on to this that after you finish drinking alcohol, cortisol, your stress hormone, spikes. And this explains why I felt so anxious when I got out of bed this morning. The good news is that after a long enough abstinence from alcohol, your hormone levels will go back to their baseline normal standard level. A paper by Fies Torres, Miranda, Ruiz, and Ortega found that alcohol increased blood testosterone as well in women and lowered blood testosterone concentrations in men. When you drink alcohol, you are also drinking other things, obviously. 2 different wines taste different because of the different chemicals in the drink producing different flavor profiles. You can tell the difference between beer and vodka because of the other chemicals that are present in those two. So is there something else in alcoholic drinks that worsen hangovers? In 2009, a study by Andrew Mitchinson was conducted, and in this study, subjects were given a measured dose of either caffeine-free cola to act as a control, bourbon, or vodka. Bourbon is darker than vodka because it has a higher amount of congeners. I'm not sure if this is a GIF thing and it's congeners, but I'm going to say congeners. And the author wanted to know if more congeners made hangovers worse. The congeners did not affect the subject's sleep, although the ethanol did, with everybody that drank the ethanol having a much poorer sleep. The subjects who drank the bourbon did, however, have worse hangovers than those who drank the vodka. So, this adds credence to the claim that darker drinks make your hangover worse. Again, it's those congeners that darken the drink. A 2014 study found that mixing alcohol and caffeine does not make your hangover worse. Often we have vodka Red Bull, something like that. Espresso martini is my personal favorite, although that's not what I was drinking last night. It's mainly beers. This study, though, that found that caffeine
doesn't make your hangover worse. The methods were that the subjects drank until they had a blood alcohol content of 0.12%. In the wild, though, when you're out at Mooseheads or whatever, Ivy, what is it in Melbourne? I don't know. Crown. You might feel less drunk in the wild and you're drinking caffeine, which might make you more prone to going and buying more drinks, further increasing your blood alcohol content and thus worsening your hangover. But what about sugar? A 1976 study gave 30 male volunteers just over a gram of ethanol per kilogram of body weight. So that kind of makes it more equal. You can imagine if you weigh 60 kilos and you have 2 shots, that's going to affect you much differently to someone that has, that weighs 110 kilos and then they have 2 shots. So just over a gram per kilogram of body weight. And then some of them were given glucose or fructose while drinking, and some of them were not. Of the group that weren't given any sugar while they were drinking, some of them were given sugar the following morning when they were hungover. The subjects in the morning were then asked to rate their subjective hangover experience, and their reaction times and coordination were objectively tested. Those who had sugar and alcohol at the same time had better reaction times, but worse coordination than those that only had ethanol. But don't take this too seriously. This study only had 30 people, remember. That could just been chance, And you've got so many different test groups that even if one person had a significant effect, or it could have just been that one person that had an outweighed change in the results. So you can't generalize from 30 dudes that took place in this study to the whole world. Luckily, there's more than one paper on this. A very similar study from the same year, published in the European Journal of Clinical Investigation, included 109 volunteers. Now we're talking. So these guinea pigs were used, and they found that neither fructose or glucose had any significant effect on the intensity of alcohol intoxication, so how drunk they were, or hangover. No effect on the rate of ethanol elimination, so the sugar didn't increase the amount of those enzymes that get rid of the alcohol. However, blood glucose concentrations were lower and blood was more acidic in the group that drank without sugar, which, makes sense. You have more fatty acids to try and compensate for the lack of sugar, and fatty acids are acids, so more acidic blood. I speculate that if you're going on a multi-day bender without eating, your blood sugar would get very low and make you feel terrible if you weren't drinking any sugar. I also speculate, this is just me, shooting the shit, that the reason this myth exists is that it's much easier to drink sugary drinks than just beer or dry wine. Thus, if one is drinking sugary mixed drinks, one might drink more than they otherwise would, and that would cause a more severe hangover. This might not come as a surprise to many of you, but according to Examine, drinking alcohol after meals reduces peak blood alcohol levels, regardless of nutrient composition. This is thought to be due to the food delaying the time it takes for your stomach to empty. So your stomach fills up with food, your stomach goes, all right, I'm going to hold this for a couple hours. That also holds the alcohol too. And alcohol is not absorbed very quickly in the stomach. It's absorbed much faster further down your digestive tract in the duodenum. So in English, this means you'll get more f***ed up more quickly if you don't eat. We know that alcohol affects your brain. Heavy alcohol consumption is well known to literally shrink your brain. A paper in Nature last year also found that even drinking on average 1 to 2 UK alcoholic standard units, so that is basically the same as one standard drink in Australia, on average 1 to 2 alcohol standard units causes a decrease in brain size. And seriously, if you're pregnant, try not to drink. It doesn't matter how much money you make or the color of your skin. If you drink alcohol while you're pregnant, depending on the term you're in, you'll shrink your baby's brain, leading to permanent neurological damage, as in they'll have difficulties learning.
Fetal alcohol syndrome is so real. According to Arizona State University and the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners, even one drink during the first 8 weeks of pregnancy can cause birth defects. And after that time, there is still a risk of negatively impacted development. If you do drink, the effects on your brain or your baby's brain can be limited by stopping drinking. The people you hang around has an effect on your consumption. So if you want to consume less alcohol, hang out with people that consume less. If you feel like you're on a never-ending loop with alcohol and you're worried about it, I suggest bringing it up with your GP, who will work with you without judgment to move you to a place where you can control your alcohol consumption. That being said, 1 or 2 drinks might help you blabber something out, meet someone that you otherwise wouldn't meet, and connection is really valuable. Isolation is terrible. It's very bad for your mental health. So perhaps, making those little connections with people at the bar, it's worth it. Do your own calculation, but I'm not trying to tell you how to live your life. Why don't eclipses happen more often? That's a question that comes from Theo, shout out, and it's an excellent one. The Earth and Moon and Sun are on an endless loop, always spinning around each other. And if you consider this is a twirling dance, then every time the moon circles around the Earth, it would block the Earth's view of the sun, who is standing in the middle of the dance floor. A solar eclipse happens when the moon crosses in front of the sun and casts a shadow onto Earth. Now, if the moon's orbit was completely in line with the orbit of the Earth around the sun, we would get an eclipse every month. But space is 3-dimensional. And the moon's orbit is tilted by 5 degrees. So most of the time, the shadow of the moon misses the Earth, and we don't get a solar eclipse. So in the dancing scenario, it's kind of like the moon either jumps or does the worm most of the time so that the Earth and the sun can maintain eye contact. So basically the moon doesn't get in the way. Even though we're heading outdoors more often and we're getting out of winter, I'm still feeling a little under the weather. But should I reach for cough syrup? Do over-the-counter cough syrups work? Let's check the science. Glycerol is in many products, such as burn treatment, because of its capacity to moisturize. It's often in cough syrup too, and its soothing effect on dry throats make it a good candidate to soothe a cough, according to a 2017 paper by Eccles and Malafet. But they didn't actually test this theory on anyone. They just speculate. Often, thyme and ivy are used in cough medicine. In an observational paper from Germany, in which, an observational paper means that scientists just watch a bunch of people, 730 to be exact, take cough syrup, and then they ask them how they feel after taking it. This is not a randomized control trial. There's no control group. People just reported what they felt. So in this paper, people said that the time it took for the cough syrup to take effect ranged from very quickly to very, very slowly. After 4 days, the researchers checked to see if the patient's symptoms were better. And of course, they were, because most colds only last for a few days. So I'm tossing this paper into the bin because it's rubbish. It's not looking very good for cough syrups. But here's the nail in the coffin. The 2002 paper published in the British Medical Journal, one of my top go-to sources for high-quality information. The paper reviewed randomized control trials of over-the-counter cough medicines. The conclusion was, and I quote, "Over-the-counter cough medicines for acute cough cannot be recommended because there is no good evidence for their effectiveness," end quote. This is echoed by a 2014 paper by Susan Smith and colleagues. They do not recommend cough syrup for easing the symptoms of cough. And they do say that higher quality data is needed to determine the effectiveness of these treatments. Does honey work? A meta-analysis by Olabisi Uduole and colleagues in 2018 looked at a bunch of average papers and found no strong evidence for or against the use of honey. They did say giving honey for up to 3 days is probably more effective in relieving symptoms compared with placebo. So these papers that they looked at, just very low quality, not enough people. The dosage was different.
the effect size was small or just relevant. And they mention that. They say, look, even though we looked at all these papers, none of them were very good. But yeah, honey, probably more effective than placebo. What about Chinese herbs? There's not enough evidence. There's not enough evidence of their effectiveness or of their side effects, according to a 2008 systematic review by Wei and colleagues. So what do I suggest? Well, first of all, don't waste your money on over-the-counter cough syrup, and do your PhD in whether or not cough syrups actually work. Do a large-scale randomized control trial. Do single ingredient interventions for every single thing. So some of it's thyme, so just use thyme. Some of it's like elderflower, just look at elderflower. And then do combinations, compare those to placebos. Yeah,